Say, will somebody please pass the ketchup?
This is a tasty burger.
I'll take a Vornese burger and a side of Jason fingers.
Don't skimp on the meat. I got a real good eye for prime meat.
Welcome to Hamburgers Horror, the home of meat, monsters, and many, many horror movies. I'm Noah Hook, and today I'm very excited to share my rankings of every new horror movie I watched in 2022. It ended up being a really great year for horror. We got so many films ranging from slashers, creature features, horror comedies, and more often than not, really unique films that blend a bunch of genres together. I still have over 100 films on my watch list from last year. It was easily the most abundant year we've had for horror since at least 2019. I myself managed to watch 60 horror films last year, and I'm happy to say I enjoyed most of them. I'll be going through all of these films from my least to most favorite, and this ranking will pretty much be based on my enjoyment of the films. That being said, I did take overall quality, scariness, uniqueness, visual effects, and lots of other components like that into consideration when I made these rankings. And I've also made an active effort to show off the diversity of the horror films we got this year, so it's not just a bunch of my favorite kinds of horror movies. I really wanted to show the range of things we got. I don't usually give films a numerical or star-based ranking in my reviews, but for this list I actually kept track of my watches on Letterboxd, so I'll include the rating I gave each film on there as well. I'll also leave a link to my Letterboxd list below, be sure to follow me there. And as a general breakdown for how I rated these films, this is how you can associate the amount of stars with my enjoyment of the film. So a half star is a downright miserable waste of time, 1 star is still pretty terrible, 1.5 has some good components but is still pretty bad, 2 stars is getting there but is still a bit of a letdown, and 2.5 stars is an average film, not disappointing but not something I'll think about too much into the future. 3 stars is where I start to identify strong films with specifically exciting aspects. 3.5 stars is what I would describe as a great film, and 4 stars go to really great films that blew me away. And 4 stars is actually the highest anything will get today. I reserve 4.5 and 5 stars for films that have stood the test of time and have had a ton of influence, or for newer films that I've at least been able to watch more than a few times so I can truly stand by it. I've pretty much only seen each of these films once or twice, so for them to move higher, I will need to spend more time with them. Hopefully all of that makes sense, but at the end of the day, this is just one guy's list. I'm going to do my best to explain my reasoning with each choice, but there's obviously going to be a few choices in here you probably disagree with. And that's okay. Please share your favorites of 2022 with me down in the comments below. I really want to know what they are. But with all of that said, it's probably time we start the rankings. Coming in dead last by a fair margin is Jeepers Creepers Reborn. Directed by Timo Vuorensola and starring Sidney Craven and Jero Benjamin, this creature feature follows a woman traveling with her boyfriend to a horror festival, where she begins having visions about the legendary creeper's return. I mean, this makes part 3 look like a fucking masterpiece in comparison, and I was really excited for this franchise to get a reboot. I grew up really loving the first film before I learned about Victor Salva, which kind of turned me off from the franchise, but I was so excited to see new life breathed into it and this really cool monster without his involvement. Unfortunately, there is just nothing redeemable about this film. The acting is bad, the story is bad, the effects are really fucking bad, the creeper looks worse than a Spirit Halloween costume, and it's just never scary or fun. I mean, yes, I have seen worse movies before, but if I was going to tell you to skip any movie on this list, this would be the one. The second worst film of the year goes to The Requin. Directed by Lee Van Kett and starring Alicia Silverstone and James Tupper, this oceanic outing follows a couple on a romantic getaway in Vietnam that find themselves stranded at sea when a tropical storm sweeps away their villa. In order to survive, they are forced to fight the elements and the hungry shark circling below. Holy cow, this movie was hard to watch. I go in with extremely low expectations for cheap-looking shark movies, but this might just be the worst one I've ever seen. All of the shark stuff is just documentary stock footage of sharks or really terrible CGI. They are so clearly on a green screen stage and not the ocean. Like, why make a film that takes place on the ocean if you're not gonna film on the fucking ocean? But what's worse is the protagonists are absolutely unbearable. All they do is argue and make stupid decision after stupid decision. It's miserable. Alicia Silverstone's character is especially bad. Her two settings are either crying or screaming her ass off. The only reason this wasn't dead last is because some of the lines and the line delivery was so absurdly bad I burst out laughing, and that made it slightly enjoyable at times, but trust me when I say this film as a whole is not. Coming in at number 58 is Slayers. Directed by K. Asher Levin and starring Thomas Jane and Kara Hayward, this horror comedy follows a vampire hunter whose life mission is to take revenge on the bloodsuckers who killed his daughter. After tracking them for years, he is forced to partner with a motley crew of social media influencers who have been invited to their hidden base as a snack. There are a lot of films on this list that incorporate streamers, influencers, and Gen Z culture, and this is definitely the cringiest of the bunch. It's filled with stock footage and poorly dubbed lines, and once again it's neither funny nor scary. I'm not sure what kind of debt Thomas Jane got himself into, but I hope he was able to pay it off with this. Up next is Where the Scary Things Are. Written and directed by B. Harrison Smith and starring Selena Flancha and Michael Cervantes, this 2022 horror follows a group of high school friends that discover a hideous, semi-human mutant. They keep it prisoner while shooting repulsive viral videos, but the gang's hunger for likes drives them to film the beast performing murderous acts. For a low-budget horror, this actually had surprisingly good cinematography, acting, and effects, but the plot was just so miserable. The teenagers are all so narcissistic and cruel, there is nobody here to root for. They do get what they deserve by the end, but the film is just so mean-spirited, it's just not one I'm ever gonna revisit. Coming in at 56 is Toe. Directed by Vanessa Alexander and starring Caitlin Gerard and Kane Hodder, this psychological slasher follows a pair of twins who escaped a serial killer called the Mechanic during their childhood. With the Mechanic's death sentence looming, the women begin finding themselves being haunted by the deranged tow truck driver. Toe is the first of a few different Tubi original films that I watched in my free time, and it kind of goes without saying that they aren't great films. They're always super low budget projects, usually by first time directors, so I'm glad that they exist so young directors can build their resumes and gain some skills. But Toe ultimately suffers from its low budget and the very visible inexperience by people involved. The acting isn't great, the kills are really bare bones, and while the junkyard setting is a highlight of the film, it still isn't all it could have been. But the script is ultimately the film's weakest point. It relies super heavily on flashbacks again and again of the same event, and they don't give Kane Hodder anything fun to do here. Up next is Jack Frost. No, not that one. Directed by Liana Failla and starring Sarah Cohen and Stephen Staley, this Christmas slasher follows a family whose ancestors once battled an evil spirit called Jack Frost. The frozen fiend is back for revenge and world domination, and the family will have to unite if they hope to survive. This shit was really bad. The only reason it's above Toe is because I was laughing my ass off at Jack's terrible one-liners. This has no relation to the Jack Frost Killer Snowman movies, but believe me when I say the puns here make those movies look like Shakespeare. Not to mention Jack is supposed to be a demigod, but he's just constantly getting pushed over and kicked by teenage girls. It's very lackluster to say the least. Coming in even higher than I expected to is Evil Bong 8 Infinity High. Written and directed by Charles Band and starring Sonny Carl Davis and Thomasina Atkins, the 8th entry in the Evil Bong saga follows Rabbit as he finally gets his act together and opens a restaurant. Will he and Evie's story end on a high note, or will their years of shenanigans finally land them in hot bong water? Fucking kill me now. So this is a franchise I watch with very low expectations. It started off poor and it has only gotten worse with each installment. This might not be the very worst entry in the franchise, but it's just a really dull way to end the saga. The stoner energy is low and the general overall energy is low. If you're a fan of the franchise or a completionist, I guess give it a shot, but I doubt most of y'all have any interest anyways. Up next is Grim Cuddy. Directed by John Ross and starring Sarah Wolfkind and Shannon Sossamon, this creature feature follows a brother and sister who must face off with an evil internet meme that has been brought to life through the paranoia of concerned parents. I don't have much to say about this one, it's about as dumb as it sounds. It's a bit like Smiley or Slender Man, except the design here is super questionable. It only got this far up because the full body shots of Grim Cuddy are fucking hilarious. Coming in at 52 is The Privilege. Directed by Felix Fuchsteiner and Katharina Schode, this film follows a wealthy teen and his friends attending an elite private school who uncover a dark conspiracy while looking into a series of strange supernatural events. This movie is completely fine from a technical standpoint, but I'll be damned if it isn't the single most confused plot on this list. Not confusing, confused. It's got weird family secret kind of stuff, ghost stuff, and a weird fungal parasite stuff all jammed into one mystery that's just really hard to follow. And I don't really care to follow because very few films about uber-rich teenagers can really make me give a shit. The film also just depicts high schoolers in the most ridiculous way, throwing giant raves and having erotic threesomes, so even if the plot was something worth following, there's nothing of substance from the characters to enjoy. Up next is Pray for the Devil. Directed by Daniel Stamm and starring Jacqueline Byers and Colin Salmon, this paranormal horror follows a young nun who has felt compelled to become the first female exorcist in the wake of several demonic possessions. Sister Anne finds herself in a battle for the soul of a young girl who she believes is possessed by the same demon that tormented her own mother years ago. This is another film where there's basically nothing wrong with it, but it has nothing new to say or do or show you. It's also PG-13, which isn't necessarily bad, but in this case it means there's nothing scary going on at all. Christian possession films in general are some of my least favorite. The vast majority are just so unoriginal. Pray for the Devil has a few good moments here and there, but it's ultimately an amalgamation of a bunch of films you've seen before. Crawling into the 50th spot is Croc. Directed by Paul W. Franklin and starring Cyan Altman and Mark Haldor, this creature feature has a fucking crocodile attack the families attending a wedding in the English countryside. Y'all know exactly what kind of movie this is when you see that terrible CGI. Sit back and enjoy the crap. Up next is Dash Cam. This found footage flick follows a self-deluded live-streaming improv musician after she abandons LA for London to avoid COVID restrictions. She steals her ex-bandmate's car and makes the fateful decision to give a ride to an elderly woman who is not what she seems. This is really the only film I dislike on a moral level. This and Deadstream actually have a lot in common, but this one just pushes the unlikable protagonist bit to the extreme. I'm all for political satire that pokes fun at either end or both ends of the political spectrum, but I just don't see the point of this protagonist. The character Annie Hardy is an awful piece of shit who treats everyone around her terribly, all while spouting alt-right and anti-vax propaganda. I understand Savage wants to create these contemporary, technologically based films that feel like we're watching real people, but I just don't understand why this is the hero of our story. It just doesn't play any kind of thematic role in what happens. No lessons are learned and there's no change of heart, so I never felt even remotely compelled to root for this scumbag. I'm not strictly opposed to characters or even protagonists who have different views than I do, but if you're going to make a super political character, make the rest of the movie super political and have a message. From a technical standpoint, Dashcam has some cool stuff going on, but I just couldn't care less the whole time because the character is unbearable. It's Morbin time! Directed by Daniel Espinosa and starring Jared Leto, Matt Smith, and Adria Arjano, this new entry in Sony's Spider-Man universe follows a doctor seeking a cure for his rare blood disorder, ultimately turning himself into a bloodthirsty vampire. All memes aside, this is just a very mediocre superhero movie. I wasn't even sure if I'd put it on the list because it's not really a horror movie. I honestly appreciate Sony and Marvel taking a chance on a much lesser known character, but this movie just falls into all of the blockbuster superhero movie trappings. Morbius hasn't got nearly enough blood, and all of the cool prosthetics are way overworked with CGI. Coming in at 47 is Firestarter. Directed by Keith Thomas and starring Ryan Kiera Armstrong and Zac Efron, Firestarter follows a young girl with the ability to create fire with her mind. A shadowy government agency is hunting her family down in order to harness the power of her rage. This is the first of many very unnecessary remakes on this list. It replaces real fire with CGI and switches around who gets captured by the agency in a way that makes her mastery of her power feel a bit unearned. Aside from that, it doesn't really do anything different from the original, and it's ultimately just a pretty boring film. Up next is The Munsters. Directed by Rob Zombie and starring Sherry Moon Zombie and Jeff Daniel Phillips, this horror comedy follows a vampire named Lily who falls in love with Herman, an oafish green experiment with a heart of gold. It's not all smooth sailing in the cemetery though, as Lily's father has other plans for his beloved daughter's future. I feel bad putting The Munsters this far down. It's a cute little film made for kids who are getting into horror movies, and those are super important. But I just have no nostalgia for The Munsters, and it wasn't the kind of humor I can really have fun with. It's not the awful dumpster fire that extreme Rob Zombie haters make it out to be, but it's also not a film I think I'll ever revisit. Props to Zombie for doing something genuinely wholesome though. I appreciate his love for violent bloody schlock and childhood spooky stuff alike. Coming in at 45 is Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Directed by David Blue Garcia and starring Elsie Fisher and Sarah Yarkin, this 2022 direct sequel to the original TCM follows a group of social media influencers hoping to buy up an old Texas town to build their idealistic business venture. Their dream soon becomes a nightmare when they disrupt the home of a now elderly Leatherface, causing the dormant serial killer to fall back into his old ways. Yay, another extremely disappointing entry in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise. For those who don't know, the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre is my favorite film of all time, and for the life of me, I can't understand how and why they keep making such terrible sequels and reboots. This film has zero atmosphere and none of the overwhelming dread that the original gave us. That's replaced by a few attempts at social commentary that just don't feel important by the end and all. This film has zero atmosphere and none of the dread the original gave us. That is replaced by a few attempts at social commentary that simultaneously feel way too heavy-handed and way too unimportant by the end of the film. They scrape at gentrification and the urban versus rural divide, but don't go anywhere with it. And the most puzzling is the ham-fisted school shooting aspect. I don't know who thought that was a good idea. None of the characters outside of the lead are even remotely likable, and this is the single most absurd way I've ever seen a legacy final girl be brought back. It got this high up because there are some really good kills in here, and there's some neat stuff going on with the cinematography, but ultimately it was a disappointment. Coming in at 44 is VHS 99. This anthology, consisting of 5 shorts made by various directors, all take place in 1999, featuring punk rock ghosts, an undead sorority pledge, a vengeful family, a mysterious new neighbor, and a literal journey to hell. Anthologies can be really hit or miss. It's just really challenging to bring together a bunch of short stories that aren't really related and make them feel like they are. VHS 99 unfortunately doesn't pull it together by the end. The films range too much in quality, and they just don't combine to create any sort of thematic point to the film. Stephen Ogg gave a fun performance, and the props and setting for the final segment were a lot of outrageous fun, but even with that, none of the segments on their own really stood out to me. The 43rd spot goes to Choose or Die. Directed by Toby Meekins and starring Iola Evans and Asa Butterfield, this British horror follows a broke college student pursuing an unclaimed cash prize for beating an obscure 1980s survival computer game. The game quickly leaves the screen and enters her life though, forcing her to make dangerous choices within reality-warping challenges. I came into Choose or Die with pretty low expectations and actually had a pretty good time with it. I couldn't help but think of films like 976 Evil and Brain Scan while watching, as the plot really forces it into that niche kind of subgenre. The film leaves a lot of the violence to the viewer's imagination, but there was a decent build-up of dread throughout, plus you get some fun voice acting from Robert Englund, which is always a treat. At the end of the day, Choose or Die was a pretty forgettable film, but I think this is where I draw the line of films I have more good to say than bad. Coming in at 42 is Terror Train. Yep, somebody decided we needed a remake of Terror Train. Directed by Philippe Gagnon and starring Robin Allamore and Tim Rozan, this 2022 remake of the 1980 classic follows a group of college seniors boarding a party train for a Halloween-themed bash, but their fun spirals into fear when a mysterious assailant begins killing the passengers one by one. This was another low-budget outing from Tubi, and Terror Train is one of the last films I would ever think we'd get a remake of. The original is a fine little horror film, but ultimately not very memorable, I guess except for the twist kind of ending. There wasn't really anything great about the remake either. The acting was pretty bad, and the train setting got pretty mundane. But what Terror Train lacked in technical chops, it made up for in fun. The killer took advantage of the party setting by constantly switching costumes, and the twist managed to remain faithful while still switching things up as well. It's far from a masterpiece, but if you're looking for a cheap, campy slasher, I'd say give it a go. Up next is Sharkbait. Directed by James Nunn and starring Holly Earl and Catherine Haney, this creature feature follows a group of college students who steal some jet skis while partying in Mexico. Of course, they end up trashing them and stranded in the ocean, where a hungry shark is waiting. I watched Sharkbait right after the Requin, and this thing looked like a damn masterpiece in comparison. In reality, it's just a very mediocre shark movie, but sometimes that's all you need. The acting was surprisingly good, it looked like it was actually filmed on the ocean, and the shark attacks were pretty vicious. It gets a bit bogged down by a cheating boyfriend subplot, but aside from that, it's very bare bones and straight to the point. Just don't go into Sharkbait looking for anything you haven't seen before, and you'll probably have a fun time with it. Coming in at number 40 is Goodnight Mommy. Directed by Matt Sobel and starring Naomi Watts, this remake of the Austrian film follows a pair of twin brothers who arrive home to find their mother's demeanor altered and her face covered in surgical bandages. As her behavior gets stranger, they begin to suspect the woman beneath the gauze is not who she says she is. There isn't much wrong with Goodnight Mommy, but there is just no reason for this film to exist. The original was made in 2014 for fuck's sake. This money could have gone to an original script if Americans could learn to read damn subtitles. Number 39 is a big one with Halloween Ends. Directed by David Gordon Green and starring Jamie Lee Curtis and Rohan Campbell, the final film in the new trilogy takes place 4 years after the events of Halloween Kills. Laurie has decided to liberate herself from fear and rage and embrace the beauty of life. But when a young man is accused of killing a boy he was babysitting, It ignites a cascade of violence and terror that will force Laurie to finally confront the evil she can't control. Go watch my review if you want to hear my full thoughts, but this is just a bizarre direction to take this franchise. I appreciate the courage to switch things up. It's a technically well-made film, and we do get to see Laurie find closure by the end, but this is just such a lame way for Michael Myers' saga to end. Up next is Amma. Directed by Iris Shim and starring Sandra Oh and Fievel Stewart, this supernatural horror follows a mother named Amanda whose introverted farm life is disrupted when her own mother passes away. Haunted by memories of abuse, it seems Amanda's Amma is hell-bent on sticking around. This one is a very passable horror film, but it's also a hodgepodge of 20 other films you've seen before. It had decent atmosphere and a couple good scares, but not even my Grey's Anatomy queen could make Amma more than the sum of its parts. If you got mommy issues, it might be a good movie for you though. Coming in at 37 is Studio 666. Directed by B.J. McDonnell and starring the Foo Fighters, this supernatural horror comedy follows the legendary rock band as they move into a mansion steeped in grisly rock and roll history. Once in the house, Dave Grohl finds himself grappling with supernatural forces that threaten both the completion of their new album and the lives of the band. This one was pretty lame. Not lame as in the movie was bad necessarily, but more lame in the sense that this is Dad Rock the horror movie. Your enjoyment of the film will definitely hinge on your familiarity with the Foo Fighters, of which I have none. The acting is pretty subpar because they're not actors, and the comedy failed to get very many laughs from me. The standout aspect of the film is definitely its kills though. They were surprisingly gnarly, and the effects were good enough that I'd recommend this movie for them alone. Once it gets going, Studio 666 is pretty fun, but it's probably not a film I'll revisit many times in my life. Up next is Deadstream. Directed by Vanessa and Joseph Winter and starring the latter, the film follows a disgraced streamer attempting to win back his followers by spending a night alone in a haunted house. But when he accidentally pisses off a vengeful spirit, his big comeback event becomes a real-time fight for his life. This is a movie I really wanted to like more than I do. It has some really funny moments, some really great use of its POV camera, and some really absurd practical effects. But why do all of the live stream horror movies this year have such annoying protagonists? This is not dashcam levels of bad, but the narcissistic, problematic YouTube personality stopped being original like 10 years ago. The format felt pretty fresh with its replication of Twitch, but all of the jokes about this guy's problematic internet antics fell pretty flat for me. It's ultimately a silly, gross film that I had some fun with, and from what I can tell, a lot of people enjoyed it a lot more than I did, so I definitely say Deadstream is worth a shot. Coming in at 35 is Old People. Directed by Andy Fetcher and starring Malika Farutan and Steven Luca, this German horror follows a family who must fight to survive when their secluded town's senior citizens are struck by an illness that turns them into a horde of mindless killing machines. I wasn't expecting a ton going into a movie called Old People, but it just barely exceeded my expectations. The film is basically The Crazies, but they're all 60 plus. But what surprised me most was just how violent the killers were. There were some really extended, violent, depressing attack sequences. And the film's ultimate message is that we need to care more for our older generations, so I can somewhat forgive it for its questionable use of them. Up next is Dark Glasses. Directed by Daddy Dario Argento and starring Elenia Pastorello, this giallo follows a prostitute who damages her eyes while looking at an eclipse. She finds herself being targeted by a serial killer, which gets her into a car accident that leaves her completely blind and a little boy orphaned. She takes in the boy, unaware the killer is still after her. Dude, this shit was a hot fucking mess and I ate up every second of it. It's got the classic misogynistic black-gloved killer, a German shepherd ripping out throats, and a bizarre buddy cop relationship between a blind prostitute and a little Chinese boy. What more could you possibly ask for? Ultimately, the film is far and away from Argento's classic films, but it is better than the last couple things I've seen from him. It lacks the incredible cinematography you'd hope for, and the whole thing feels a little bit disjointed and unresolved, but iffy quality aside, I'd say give this weird little film a shot. Coming in at 33 is Hellhole. Directed by Bartosz Kowalski and starring Piotr Zurowski, this Polish horror follows a policeman going undercover in a remote monastery to gather intel about a string of disappearances. This was a fun little surprise on Netflix, especially given that the poster makes it look really bottom barrel. It had some creepy atmosphere and slowly builds up to a surprisingly interesting ending. It was a bit slow to start and seems like it's going to be pretty generic, but the last 20 minutes or so make up for that a bit. While some of the unexpected stuff pulls the film from generic city, I feel like it wasn't pushed enough to make the film truly memorable. Up next is Moloch. Directed by Nico van den Brink, and starring Sally Harmson and Alexandre William, this Dutch horror follows a family who is randomly attacked in their rural home inside a peat bog. The more Beatrix searches for an explanation, the more she becomes convinced that she is being hunted by something ancient. This one is definitely a slow burn, but I'd say the ending is worth it. The whole time you know there is something supernatural going on, but the movie leaves you just in the dark enough for you to want more. It also had more gore than I expected, and they did not shy away from it. It is another film that borrows from others in pretty recognizable ways, but all in all I'd say it's a pretty solid horror film. Be warned, it is very depressing though. Coming in just short of the list's top half is Men. Directed by Alex Garland and starring Jessie Buckley and Rory Kinnear, this 2022 horror follows a woman named Harper as she goes on a retreat in the English countryside in the hopes of healing after a personal tragedy. She soon realizes someone or something is following her, and what starts as dread soon becomes a fully formed nightmare inhabited by her darkest memories. This is another film I wanted to like more because from a technical aspect, this is such a cool film. The cinematography is gorgeous, the sound design is haunting, the performances are solid, and the visual effects in the final act are some of the coolest I've seen all of last year. But Men falls short for me in its attempts to be really smart and metaphoric, especially since its themes are just a bit thin. By the first 15 or 20 minutes, we understand that men can be shallow, sexist, and violent, and then the film just kind of reiterates that theme in increasingly strange ways until the movie ends. Harper is too busy reliving her trauma to really provide us with any personality outside of that, so the only reason we have to root for her is because she's facing microaggressions and sexism. The overall theme of toxic masculinity being a trait taught from generation to generation is important, but it's ultimately not a unique enough statement to make the crux of your film. That can be very evident subtext for sure, but for it to be the text of the film, I feel like it needed a little bit more. I'd say both Ex Machina and Annihilation are better explorations of womanhood in horror from Garland, but with Men I think he just got a bit too glued to the themes and metaphors to make a cohesive story. Starting off the top half of my list is Christmas Bloody Christmas. Directed by Joe Bagos and starring Riley Dandy, this festive outing follows a young woman named Tori looking the party on Christmas Eve, only to find herself being hunted by a bloodthirsty animatronic Santa. This movie took a really long time to get going. There is a lot of filler watching characters walk around and shooting the shit. There are definitely movies where you want to get to know the characters before they die, but this is not one of those. The one thing that kept me watching was the beautifully oversaturated neon lighting. This movie fucking bleeds Christmas spirit. And once the violence kicks in, the movie only gets better and better, and by the last 20 minutes I was having a great time. There were fun fight sequences, some really good gore effects, and some surprisingly good killer robot stuff at the end. So give yourself something to be distracted by during the first half, but stick around because it does get better. Up next is Orphan: First Kill. Directed by William Brent Hall and starring Isabel Fuhrman and Julia Stiles, this prequel follows Esther's escape from an Estonian psychiatric facility. She travels to America under her new alias as the missing daughter of a wealthy family, but when they start to catch on, Esther finds herself in even more trouble than she's used to. We're back again with an unnecessary sequel. Well, in this case, a prequel. I'd say the original Orphan is one of the single best horror movies we got in the 2000s, so I was very skeptical of this to say the least. All things considered, it was better than I expected it to be, but it was also nothing like I expected it to be. This film takes Esther's backstory that we get in the original and stretches it to extremes I would have never expected. It's definitely not scary the way the first film is, it's honestly more of an absurd dark comedy. It does provide explanations for a lot of Esther's bizarre intricacies, but the tonal shift of this film basically makes her an anti-hero, which is just a little weird. I ultimately believe the original is better off without it, but it was dumb and fun enough for me to appreciate it. Howling in at 28 is Werewolf by Night. Directed by Michael Giacchino and starring Gael Garcia Bernal, this Halloween special from Marvel follows a group of monster hunters who have assembled following the death of their leader. They participate in a deadly competition to capture a powerful relic, which is being guarded by a dangerous monster. I'm sure some people are surprised to see Werewolf by Night this low, and I would understand why. It's a really fun movie that taps into the visual style of Universal classic monsters with great cinematography and a fun score. This will surely be a divisive statement, but I'm just generally burnt out on the MCU and almost all of their projects. I just feel like I'm getting diminishing returns the longer it goes on. There are still fun projects coming out from them, this definitely being one of them, but generally they're just becoming really by the numbers. I just prefer weird indie shit over blockbuster populist films, and I believe Disney is going to make the MCU overstay its welcome and become really uninteresting. But the politics of what I just said aside, I don't have a ton of negatives about Werewolf by Night. It's got great practical effects, cinematography that actually shows some artistic merit, and it deviates from the tried and true Marvel formula in a lot of ways. I appreciate that the film doesn't overstay its welcome at a short 55 minutes, but that's also a part of why I couldn't put it any higher. The story feels small, especially when considering it just a tiny cog in the MCU machine. Werewolf by Night utilizes the aesthetics of classic monsters, but never really deviates from them or pushes the boundaries in a way that really made it interesting. Up next is Day Shift. Directed by J.J. Perry and starring Jamie Foxx and Dave Franco, this horror comedy follows an LA vampire hunter as he struggles to come up with the money necessary to pay for his kids' tuition and braces. Trying to score big gets the attention of the new boss vamp, who plans to take over the City of Angels. This is another film I came into with really low expectations and had way more fun than I expected to. The world building in the first half created a lot of depth with different types of vampires, a vampire hunting union, and lots of little details that made it feel rich. The father fighting for his child angle is overdone, and the third act is definitely the weakest as it descends into familiar final battle tropes. But it's funny, it has solid action sequences, and it has Snoop Dogg mowing down vampires with a minigun. It's good dumb fun. Up next is Piggy. Directed by Carlota Pereda and starring Laura Galan, this 2022 horror from Spain follows a teenager who witnesses the kidnapping of a clique of girls who frequently bully her. When police start asking questions, Sarah keeps quiet as she's torn between revealing the truth or protecting the man who saved her. I came into Piggy expecting a pretty cut and dry revenge flick, but it complicates that narrative in a way I haven't really seen before. It was way gorier than I expected. It's got a little bit of Saw or Hostel energy in there, but still having really nice cinematography. It only fell a bit short for me because Sarah wasn't given much personality outside of being a vessel for bullying. I understand that's partially because the film is hammering home just how constant the fat phobia and cruelty is she faces on a daily basis, but I just wish there was a little bit more for her for us to hang on to. And just as a side note, Piggy is the only film on this list with a fat person as the lead, which really shows just how shallow casting still is. Over 2/3 of the films on this list star thin, conventionally beautiful women under the age of 30. I want films to switch it up a bit more. It's obviously great that more women are getting the starring roles, which I think is a highlight of this list, especially with women of color. But give me old people, give me fat people, give me people that don't look like they're fucking supermodels. And just as importantly, give me stories that are maybe informed by those characteristics but aren't fully revolved around them. Number 25 is another big one with Scream. Directed by Matt Bettinelli-Olpin and Tyler Gillette, the 5th installment of the franchise fittingly takes place 25 years after the original. Yet another killer is donning the ghost face mask, but this time around a new group of teens find themselves being targeted. Not knowing who to trust, they turn to those who have survived numerous encounters for help. I had a lot of fun with Scream 5, and it has a lot going for it. It's the best looking Scream we've ever gotten from a technical standpoint. All of the new characters are able to hold their own with the legacy characters, and generally it works as a good bridge into following this new cast of teens. But I'm sorry to say I just didn't care as much as I wanted to. Big things happen in this movie, but they just didn't hold the weight that they would have if they happened even a movie or two ago. It's hard to care about what happens to the legacy characters because they're so clearly falling by the wayside for this new younger cast, and it's hard to care what happens to the new characters because they're standing next to these titans of horror cinema. It was also one of the more predictable killer reveals, and the reason for it was one of the most far-fetched we've gotten yet. But with all of that said, it's still a consistent, well-crafted story. It has good kills, some great scares, and of course it reflects the current state of horror in a fun way. Up next is another big one with The Black Phone. Directed by Scott Derrickson and starring Mason Thames and Ethan Hawke, this supernatural horror follows a 13-year-old boy who is abducted and kept in the basement of a sadistic serial killer known as the Grabber. When a disconnected phone on the wall begins to ring, Finney discovers that he can hear the voices of the killer's previous victims, and they are dead set on making sure what happened to them doesn't happen to him. Man, this was a film I had really high hopes for, as I think Hawke and Derrickson did some great things together in Sinister, but then I watched the trailer and I just felt like I knew what was going to happen in the movie beat for beat. And I was right, I did know what was going to happen beat for beat. All of the kids give really great performances, but you know damn well from the get-go, Finney is not going to die by the end of this movie. I spent the whole film hoping to be proved wrong, maybe not with Finney dying, but I was hoping for some kind of surprise, but it just chugged along very safely and predictably. It also feels very Stephen King-y, probably because his son wrote the book the screenplay is based off of, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but it definitely was a factor in why I didn't feel any fear for Finney. With all of that said, Hawke gives a really creepy performance as the Grabber, and while it is a predictable story, it is still an effective one. I just think there was a bit too much going on for the film to juggle, and it never really capitalized on any of it. It is a good movie and definitely earned its spot here, but I was just way too excited about all the other films above it to bring it any higher. Up next is Glorious. Directed by Rebecca McKendry and starring Ryan Quanten and J.K. Simmons, this black comedy cosmic horror follows a depressed man trying to cope with a breakup. He finds himself trapped inside a rest stop bathroom with a mysterious figure in the stall next to him. He soon realizes the situation is much bigger than he could possibly imagine. I don't want to give any spoilers on this one, so just go and watch it. It's a film I know some of you are going to hate, but I also know there's some freaks that are going to love it. Coming in at 22 is Bodies, Bodies, Bodies. Directed by Helena Regine and starring Amanda Stendelberg and Maria Bakalova, this horror comedy follows a group of 20-somethings who decide to wait out a hurricane in one of their remote mansions. A party game goes very wrong when a member of the group ends up dead, as many fake friendships begin to crumble as they try to figure out who the killer is. As we've already seen, 2022 was a big year for utilizing Gen Z culture, talking point, and buzzwords, and Bodies is probably the most widely seen of the kinds of films that do it. I was skeptical going in, but ended up having a lot of fun with it. The Gen Z language feels genuine and is used in a lot of funny ways, while still being sarcastic enough to keep me from rolling my eyes. The whodunit works pretty well, and I was ultimately really satisfied with the killer's reveal, and it's nice to see A24 moving away from strictly doing elevated horror to play with the whodunit works pretty well with lots of potential suspects, and I was ultimately satisfied with the killer's reveal. It isn't groundbreaking or anything, but it's cool to see A24 move away from strictly elevated horror to play with the slasher format. Up next is The Cursed. Directed by Sean Ellis and starring Kelly Riley and Boyd Holbrook, this creature feature follows a village in 19th century France. After slaughtering a group of Romani people, a land baron's son goes missing and another boy is murdered. The locals suspect a wild animal, but a visiting pathologist warns of a more sinister presence lurking in the woods. I love a well-done period piece, but I often find those kinds of films spend too much time basking in the aesthetics. I love a good period piece horror, but I find that a lot of them spend so much time basking in the aesthetics that the story kind of falls behind. The Cursed definitely doesn't fall into that category though. It has a ton going on. It's one of the most unique iterations of a werewolf I've seen in a long time, while still paying homage to the classics. The film is oozing with atmosphere, and I was very happy to see some really cool practical effects near the end. There was a really great long shot pretty early on that really won me over, but the cinematography just kept hitting me with cool shots afterward. It's pretty slow here and there, but in a year with very few monsters, I was very happy to see it. Alright, we're moving into the top 20. I enjoyed a lot of the films up to this point, but I knew very early on that these were my favorites of the year. You'll hear some little critiques here and there, but generally I recommend all of these. Coming in at number 20 is Significant Other. Directed by Robert Olson and Dan Burke, and starring Micah Monroe and Jake Lacey, this 2022 horror follows a couple taking a romantic backpacking trip through the Pacific Northwest. They make an unexpected discovery that sets them on a strange, frightening new path. The couple aren't alone in the woods, and they might not be the same if and when they manage to escape. Oh man, this was a pleasant surprise. This is another one I'm not going to give any spoilers for, so just go give it a shot. Both leads give dynamic performances, the setting is lush with danger, and I promise you will not know where this movie is going. Up next at number 19 is Resurrection. Directed by Andrew Simmons and starring Rebecca Hall and Tim Roth, this 2022 horror follows a woman whose carefully constructed life is upended when an unwelcome shadow from her past returns, forcing her to confront the monster she's evaded for 2 decades. This shit was so weird and unpleasant, not an outlandish kind of weird, but in a really off-putting kind of way. Without getting into too much detail, there is an interesting blend of reality and hallucination with a really dark event Without getting into too much detail, there was a really ambiguous blend of reality and hallucination with a really dark event at the core of it. If you have kids, I would go in cautiously, but damn, Rebecca Hall gives a hell of a performance here, and there is such a tense atmosphere throughout. It isn't a movie that wants to scare you or have a good time with you, it wants to make you feel like shit by the end, and I think it's pretty successful. It's definitely the kind of film that frustrates viewers who hate irrational decisions, but for this film, you're gonna have to dive into the irrational. But if you can do that with a bit of patience during the slow parts, you'll be in for a cruel exercise in manipulation and revenge. Let's keep the weird shit going with Crimes of the Future. Directed by David Cronenberg and starring Viggo Mortensen and Léa Seydoux, this psychological sci-fi horror takes place in a future where the human species undergoes new transformations and mutations. The film follows performance artists, government officials, and a mysterious group all experimenting with the growth of brand new organs in this sexy, violent web of body horror. It's great to have Daddy Cronenberg back. I was truthfully a bit wary of this just because we haven't seen Cronenberg tackle horror in a decent while now. But he moves his classic style into the contemporary with this one for sure. It's full of performance art, microplastics, and eating disorders, and while it felt very confusing at the beginning, it came together very nicely at the end. As usual with Cronenberg, he throws us right into this complex world and forces us to figure it out. With so many characters lying and having secret motives, it really keeps us in the dark for a while. There isn't anyone to really like or root for here, but the performances are really off-kilter and strange. Plus we get a bunch of weird alien bug massage chairs, what's not to like? Up next is You Won't Be Alone. Directed by Goran Stolevsky and starring Sara Klimoska and Anna Maria Marisna. This 2022 horror takes place in 19th century Macedonia, where a young girl is kidnapped and then transformed into a witch by an ancient spirit. Curious about life as a human, the witch accidentally kills a peasant in a nearby village and then takes her victim's shape to live in her skin. Her curiosity ignited, she continues to wield this horrific power to understand what it means to be human. This right here takes the title for most beautiful horror movie of the year. The cinematography is breathtaking from start to finish, and it's only highlighted by the witch's voiceover most of the film where she's pondering her own existence. The witch objectively observes the beauty and cruelty inherent to humanity, all while keeping a very fluid, dreamlike state. There are very few films where creatures literally wear human skin as camouflage, and I love every single one of them. I only wish the ending was a bit more climactic. The little hints of body horror throughout are really great, but I think just a little bit more could have pushed the otherworldly nature of the witch. It's definitely an art house kind of film, so if you don't like loose stories and subtitles, maybe skip it, but I'd say it's definitely worth a watch. Coming in at 16 is No Exit. Directed by Damien Power and starring Havana Rose Liu, this 2022 horror thriller follows a recovering addict who discovers an abducted child hidden in a car outside a rest stop. Stranded in a blizzard, she must identify the kidnappers before they escape into the night. No Exit ended up being a mysterious, tense, fun movie with a lot of unexpected twists and turns. The rest stop setting adds a great claustrophobic nature, each of the characters brings a lot of intrigue and suspicion, and the prospect of saving a child from being kidnapped adds a lot of urgency to the story. I don't think there are any truly outstanding aspects to No Exit, but I think every aspect about the film is very good. It's a lean, mean thriller, and as the tension boils over, it gets surprisingly violent. Coming in at 15 is Speak No Evil. Directed by Christian Tafdrup and starring Morten Burian and Sisdal Siem Kok, this 2022 psychological horror follows a Danish couple and their daughter who visit a Dutch family they met on holiday. What was supposed to be an idyllic weekend slowly starts unraveling as the Danes try to stay polite in the face of unpleasantness, awkwardness, and violence. Take the tension and fucked upness of Resurrection, the claustrophobia of No Exit, and an extra dose of awkwardness, and that would begin to describe the vibe here. This is another film that will have you screaming at the screen as the protagonists ignore red flag after red flag, but damn, even I wasn't expecting this to go where it did. If you feel anxiety in social settings or freeze up in awkward situations, this is a film that will feel really familiar and have you tearing your hair out. I don't want to spoil it, but parents, you might want to look up what happens in this before going in. Up next is Bones and All. Directed by Luca Guadagnino and starring Taylor Russell and Timothée Chalamet, this 2022 horror follows a pair of young cannibals who met on the road, embarking on a 3,000-mile odyssey through the back roads of America. But despite their best efforts, all roads lead back to their terrifying pasts and a final stand that will determine whether their love can survive their differences. I'm a sucker for a good road movie, and this film definitely captures the beauty and dilapidation of America through Guadagnino's beautiful cinematography. Both leads do a solid job selling the romance and the hunger, and it is way more brutal than I expected it to be. The film's cannibalism also comes to represent so many different themes throughout. Whether it be addiction, queerness, trauma, or any other form of otherness, this film definitely captures the feeling of running, hiding, and lashing out because of your difference. It was a bit slow and meandering here and there, but overall I think Bones and All was this year's best romantic horror. Coming in at 13 is Hatching. Directed by Hannah Bergholm and starring Ciro Solalina, this psychological creature feature follows a 12-year-old named Tina who is desperate to please her overbearing mother, obsessed with presenting the image of their seemingly perfect family. Everything changes when Tina finds a strange egg, and what hatches from it is beyond belief. I had no idea what the fuck to expect with this one, and it was a weird little hoot of a movie. It feels like a modern day fairy tale, infusing the wonder and dread of those stories into a truly dysfunctional family. The film has some really great set design, solid cinematography, some great practical effects, and a lot of twists and turns, so I wasn't sure where it was going. It's a weird-ass movie with such a unique vibe, I really can't name another movie quite like it. It's a bizarre musing on puberty, motherhood, perfectionism, and revenge. It dawdles a little bit in the middle for reasons you'll understand if you watch, but other than that, I have no complaints. It's a goofy, gross, absurd film with a surprisingly twisted ending. Up next is Smile. Directed by Parker Finn and starring Sosie Bacon, this psychological horror follows a therapist whose patient gruesomely commits suicide after experiencing disturbing visions of an entity smiling at her. She too begins seeing the same smile everywhere she goes, and is forced to confront her troubled past if she hopes to survive this horrifying new reality. Is it derivative of It Follows and The Ring? Yes. But it is still a lot better than I expected it to be. The trailers and marketing campaign made it seem like a cheap jump scare fest with nothing to say, but it has a lot more than jump scares and has at least a little bit something to say. Sosie Bacon gives a great performance as she slowly cracks from the fear, and the increasingly scary encounters with the entity build up a lot of dread. The smiling gimmick was used a lot more sparingly than I expected, and thank God they didn't use some ridiculous effect like in Truth or Dare. The themes are a bit heavy-handed and clunky, but that absolutely batshit ending more than made it up for me. I absolutely live for big, ridiculous monsters. Movies need to commit to showing them more. I'm also a firm believer that horror moviegoers deserve some good popcorn flicks. Not everything can be or should be elevated or art house. Sometimes it just needs to be scary and fun. Keep the schlock coming. As promised, the schlock is continuing with Terrifier II. Directed by Damien Leone and starring Lauren Lavera and David Howard Thornton, this 2022 slasher follows a brother and sister who find themselves being hunted by Art the Clown on Halloween night. As the body count rises, the siblings fight to stay alive while uncovering the true nature of Art's evil intent. Okay, let's set the record straight. This film has no right being 2 hours and 20 minutes. The fact that it's the longest film on this list is fucking ridiculous. But Terrifier 2 succeeds where the first one did as well, in the gore. It is by far the bloodiest, goriest, cruelest, torture porniest movie on this list by a fucking landslide. There are several kill sequences where Art is sawing and slashing and breaking bones for several full minutes, while the victims, usually women, just scream and cry and beg for mercy. It's not my personal cup of tea, but I respect it for being so unapologetically vicious. The practical effects look great, the sound design is absolutely disgusting, the final showdown is pretty satisfying, and Art even gets a creepy little sidekick. A lot of times when Art isn't on screen, the movie gets mediocre pretty quickly, but there was still a lot of style and visual flair that kept my attention. The world feels much more fleshed out than it did in the previous film, it has a great Halloween-y vibe, and despite the cruelty, it's a very fun movie to watch some of the time as well. It leaves some holes and unanswered questions, but I can only assume those will be answered in Terrifier 3. Please, Damien, don't make it 3 hours. Alright folks, we finally made it. Sorting out the top 20 was a big challenge, but at the moment, these are my 10 favorite horror movies of 2022. Breaking into the top 10 is Watcher. Directed by Chloe Okuno and starring Micah Monroe, this 2022 psychological horror follows an actress named Julia as she moves to Bucharest with her husband. With word of a serial killer on the loose, she begins feeling as though a neighbor from across the street is watching her. This was a huge surprise for me. It combines window-watching voyeurism with fish-out-of-water paranoia, tying it together with the resourcefulness that women who aren't listened to need to have in this world. It pays homage to Hitchcock, Polanski, and Carpenter while still feeling fresh and contemporary. It's beautifully shot, has nerve-wracking sound design, has a ton of suspense and tension, and most importantly, it plays the story completely straight. There are no real twists and turns here, the threat is established early on, and the terror just slowly builds from there. Outside of her blasé husband, Julia has no one to turn to, constantly being met with language barriers and people who assume she's overreacting or hysterical. But it handles those themes in a way that doesn't feel overbearing, as it's such a nightmare situation that even Julia is questioning that feeling in her gut. It's that feeling you get when you walk past a dark alley or hear a noise in the night. Your mind immediately goes to the worst case scenario. Watcher is a creepy reminder to trust your gut and acknowledge when the hairs on the back of your neck stand up, even if it makes you look crazy. 'Cause one day, your hysterical gut might just save your life. Coming in at number 9 is Prey. Directed by Dan Trachtenberg and starring Amber Midthunder and Dakota Beavers, this prequel to all of the Predator films follows a young Comanche warrior in 18th century North America. She sets out to protect her people from the looming threat of a dangerous new hunter, only to find herself the prey being hunted. God, why couldn't we have been getting Predator sequels like this over the past 20 years? My hopes were super low at first because the last Predator was fucking atrocious, but the second I heard the premise, I couldn't help but get excited. Prey brings the franchise back to its roots with a very simple premise. An alien is here and it wants to kill the toughest people around. Seeing a less technologically advanced Predator was great, especially since it led to so much hand-to-hand combat. The fight sequences were great, as was the cinematography in general. The grasslands and forests make for simple but beautiful battlegrounds for the two to face often, as both the Predator and Naru train in them before their final confrontation. Not to mention the invasion of European colonizers and the dark subtext their introduction leads to, with Naru's line about an incoming threat being so layered. Naru's story about a woman warrior hoping to prove herself amongst the men is definitely a familiar story, and there's a couple of lines that are a bit too on the nose for me, but generally I think it works really well. She doesn't rely on brute strength to beat the alien, she relies on her intelligence and direct observation to use the creature's tools against itself, which totally ties into the larger themes of the film. I don't think we should get a direct sequel to Prey, but I would love to see other Predator films take on this kind of format in different time periods and locations. Plus, we can all use more doggy sidekicks. Up next is Hellraiser. Directed by David Bruckner and starring Jamie Clayton and Odessa Azayan, this reboot of the 1987 classic follows a struggling addict who comes into possession of the Lament configuration. The Cenobites get summoned and begin hunting down Riley and her friends as they try to find a way to send them back to hell. Here's a film I had unworldly expectations for and was only a teensy bit disappointed in. It's got great gore, great effects, great suspense, and monstrous new Cenobites that I love. I must admit it lacks the genuine grunge and perverse sexuality that made the original so great, but I still think these are some of the sexiest and scariest Cenobites we've gotten in a long time. I'm personally glad to see the BDSM leather gone. Turning them into these fucked up skin art projects is way more interesting. It also gives all of the Cenobites time to shine. It isn't just the Pinhead show like this franchise has been stuck in for a long time. I wish the human characters, especially Riley, were a bit more likable and fleshed out, but this has never been a franchise about likable characters. It's the first film to properly and beautifully depict the blending of our worlds with the Cenobites, and the hot pink is a fun new addition to the flashy white of the originals when the Cenobites emerge. It reminded me of From Beyond, and that's always a good thing. But what brought Hellraiser this high up for me is the simple fact that we don't get many movies like this anymore. Nothing else on this list quite scratches the same itch that torture genderless demons do. It's just a simple fact. It isn't a perfect reimagining, but I do think it's a solid return to form, and I hope to see more Cenobites in the future. Coming in at lucky number 7 is Fresh. Directed by Mimi Cave and starring Daisy Edgar Jones and Sebastian Stan, this 2022 romantic horror follows a woman named Noah, good name, who takes a chance on love by giving her number to the awkwardly charming Steve after a produce section meet cute at the grocery store. This is another film I feel has gone under a lot of people's radars, so I'm going to keep the spoilers extra low. It's super depressing, super scary, super fucked up, and super fun, managing to balance a bunch of different emotions while remaining cohesive. It definitely borrows from a few films in its premise, but I felt it was thematically and stylistically unique enough to stand out from its predecessors. For a film that takes place mostly inside, it's got some beautiful cinematography, along with some fun sound design and a great score. I highly recommend you check it out without any spoilers, because I think Fresh lives up to its title. Up next at number 6 is Sissy. Directed by Kane Senace and Hannah Barlow, and starring Aisha D, this 2022 Australian horror follows a successful influencer who runs into her ex-best friend from childhood who is hoping to reconnect. Invited to a bachelorette weekend, Cecilia finds herself stuck in a remote cabin with her old school bully, and she develops a taste for revenge. This was another film nowhere near my radar when I picked it up, and boy, I'm glad I did. Out of all the films on this list that tackled the woke Gen Z culture kind of stuff, Sissy is the one to do it the most authentic and genuinely while being the most funny. This is another one I don't want to spoil, but Sissy is a really fun subversion of the slasher format. It has great atmosphere, unexpected twists, wild editing and transitioning, and a great performance by the lead. It's a little bit slow at the start, but once it gets going, it does not stop. Definitely add Sissy to your watch list. Alright folks, we've made it to the top 5. These are all heavy hitters and some of the year's most talked about films. Coming in at number 5 is Pearl. Directed by Ty West and starring Mia Goth and David Corenswet, this prequel to X provides a background to the killer as she grows up in her family's isolated farm. Dreaming of a life on the big screen, Pearl becomes sick of caring for her ailing father and overbearing mother. Pearl's ambitions, temptations, and repressions all collide in the stunning, Technicolor-inspired origin story of X's iconic villain. A lot of what I have to say about Pearl also applies to X, and the only reason it came in a bit lower is because I think it relies a bit more on X than X relies on it. It's also a much more straightforward story than X, and with it being a prequel, there's a lot less room for surprise in how it could end. That being said, Pearl is way more fun than it has any right to be. This and X are the first two films where I truly feel Ty West has been able to amplify his stories through the aesthetics of a particular time period. Pearl takes its style from Hollywood's golden age, turning Dorothy into an absolutely blood-soaked lunatic. It trades in X's slasher element for more of a psychological descent, but it is not short on gore either. This film is 100% a Mia Goth movie, and I am so here for it. It's so refreshing to see a director just let an actress run fucking wild with the material. I mean, that monologue alone is worth the price of admission. Pearl is a lush, flamboyant, horny fucking movie that I'm very glad exists. This is the kind of banana shit you only get from people who love horror movies. It totally enriches the viewing experience of X, but it also stands alone as one of 2022's best horror movies. Up next at number 4 is Nope. Directed by Jordan Peele and starring Keke Palmer and Daniel Kaluuya, this sci-fi horror follows a brother and sister whose lonely ranch becomes the hiding spot for a UFO. Set on capturing the perfect shot of it, the siblings and several locals put themselves in grave danger trying to monetize the otherworldly visitor. I was a bit conflicted on where to put Nope on this list because it is less of a traditional horror movie than a lot of the other films here. It's also a film I have some issues with. It's a bit of a chaotic mess, but it ultimately earned its spot up here by being such a unique, chaotic fever dream of a movie. It's one of the most unique takes I've seen on alien abductions in a long time, with a cool-ass alien to back it up. The cinematography is gorgeous, especially the night shots utilizing low-light cameras. There is a great mix of dark comedy going on, but also a few moments of genuine terror. The film wears its love for Spielberg on its sleeve, as it's almost like a fucked up love child between E.T. and Jaws. I think the film is a bit too beholden to its themes, but I ultimately don't mind because it has such specific, weird, important things that it is pondering. Keke Palmer is an absolute delight here, Daniel Kaluuya gives a subtly nuanced performance, and Andrew Yoon slides in for some wacky fun. It was a bit too long and slow at times, it maybe tried to bite off a bit too much, but it is a wholly unique viewing experience that I can't help but appreciate. Coming in to take the bronze medal is Barbarian. Directed by Zach Kreger and starring Georgina Campbell and Bill Skarsgård, this 2022 horror follows a woman who finds her Detroit Airbnb has been double booked with a strange man already sleeping at the property. Against her better judgment, she decides to stay the night anyway, but soon discovers that there is much more to be afraid of in the house than the other guest. This was the surprise of the fucking year right here. You can love it or hate it, because I know there's a fair amount of people that do, but this right here is what I love about horror movies. It has a wild mix of suspense, mystery, comedy, violence that I just did not expect going in. It holds its secrets close to its chest during the first half, seemingly taking us down a pretty straightforward plot, only to pull the rug out from under us. The big shift in the story, you know what I'm talking about if you've seen it, totally threw me for a loop on my first viewing. I wasn't sure what to make of it at first, but I think it tied back in a funny way. I do not want to spoil it for anybody who hasn't seen it, so if that is the case for you, definitely go watch Barbarian soon. It's a funky, fucked up horror movie that will throw you for a couple of loops throughout. But it still works on a rewatch as well, as there are subtle hints as to what is truly going on. The tonal shifting might not work for everybody, but I personally love this wacky ass film. Coming in at second place is The Menu. Directed by Mark Mylod and starring Ray Fiennes and Anya Taylor-Joy, this 2022 black comedy horror follows a couple traveling to an island to eat at an exclusive tasting menu at a World Star restaurant. The eccentric chef starts to show signs that something is off, as his menu has some shocking surprises. As a general rule in life, if a film stars Ray Fiennes, it probably fucking slaps. Not only do I think it's one of the best horror movies we got this year, I think it's the single funniest film of 2022. I like my comedy as black as my coffee, and The Menu delivers that in spades. You may know that I'm a big foodie. Kim and I love bizarre food experiences and tasting menus and other highbrow crap like that, so I was the perfect target audience for this film. It is a very cynical movie. It takes jabs at obsessive chefs, cooks blindly following their idols, foodies fetishizing their own food knowledge, critics destroying careers without adding anything of substance to the world, and especially the rich who don't appreciate the food itself. The horror is much more psychological than it is violent or bloody, but you'll still find some fucked up kills here too. Anya Taylor-Joy makes for a great lead as the one lower class individual amongst the millionaires, and all of the supporting cast shine in their atrocious roles. The film takes so many weird little turns but always stays on track, delivering us a deadly but delicious film. Well folks, we finally made it to number 1. A lot of different films have held this spot while I was making the list, but there is one that just kept crawling its way back up to the top. My number 1 spot is gonna go to X. Directed by Ty West and starring Mia Goth and Jenna Ortega, this 2022 horror follows a group of filmmakers hoping to shoot a porno in rural Texas. They rent a house belonging to an elderly couple who eventually leave the cast fighting for their lives. If y'all have seen my review of The Sacrament or a very short review I did of House of the Devil, you'll know how I feel about Ty West's earlier work. His films always have a ton of visual style and homage and a clear love for the genre, but I never feel like the stories themselves break any new ground. But as I said with Pearl, I think X is the first film where Ty West really has created a unique story that is amplified by the subgenre and time period he's paying homage to. X takes on the aesthetics of Hicksploitation films like the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Eaten Alive, and Motel Hell, but it also tells a much smaller and more human story. The straightforward and predictable route this film could have taken was for the older couple to be repulsed by the sexually progressive young people, but just about the opposite happens. It's a bizarre gateway into examining our own fears around aging as we watch our bodies sag and wrinkle and lose their conventional sex appeal. And this works so well in the 1970s, a time where dirty movies really provided a wider outlet for people to explore their sexual desires. I've seen some people take issue with the idea that the horniness of the old people is being treated as horrific, but it never really came off to me during my first or second or third watch of the film. If anything, it's a bit sad, but to me it really works as a question of, this will be you one day. Is it truly that scary? And I think that's a big part of why Mia Goth plays both Maxine and Pearl. The film is beautifully shot, it's well acted by a bunch of all-stars, including 2 of the year's biggest scream queens, the sound design is as horny as Pearl, and the violence is delightfully graphic. It's a slow burn that boils over in the third act before the characters get slaughtered, giving them enough time to be fleshed out. There could certainly be arguments for other movies that take the top spot, but for me, X hits all the buttons. It's an original story that pays homage to the classics that came before it. It's very well made on a technical standpoint, and most importantly, it's a horror movie made for horror fans. It isn't pure schlock and torture like Terrifier 2, and it's not one giant metaphor like Nope or The Menu. It has a fine balance of both of those things. It never forgets that the story should come first, all while being scary and funny and a whole bunch of other things at once. It's my personal favorite of the year, and I'm very excited to see where West takes us with Maxine. Well, there you have it, folks. Those are my rankings for 60 horror films I saw in 2022. Here is a quick breakdown of the films and the amount of stars I gave them, but I recommend you check out these films and form your own opinions on them. I hope I helped you identify a few you haven't heard of or seen before, and I hope you got hyped to check them out. I think 2022 was a great year for horror, and I'm hoping we get an even better one here in 2023. But what were your favorite films of 2022? Please let me know down in the comments. These kinds of lists are so subjective and tricky, and there's so many films I didn't get to see, so I really want to know what y'all liked best. Also, as a treat, you could let me know what your least favorite of 2022 was. Those are fun as well. Also, hop over to my Letterboxd if you want to check out the list there. It also has a bunch of other films I didn't get a chance to watch yet. Plus, you can see me talk about other weird movies that I don't get to talk about on the channel. Well, that's about it. Thank you all so much for joining me. As always, I'm Noah Hook, and thanks for watching Hamburgers and Horror. Stay safe out there. Thanks for watching me rank 60 horror movies. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe so you can keep up with all my horror-related videos. And if you want to help support this channel further, you should check out my Patreon account. You'll be able to vote for future movies and franchises I cover on the channel. Thanks, y'all.